Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. I'm the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, G3000, G5000, and Perspective Glass cockpits, the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year, and yes, I'm recovering from a little bit of a cold, so I may sound a little different today. Today we're talking about the crash of a Cessna 208 Caravan in Idaho last month, and the visual illusion pilots experience when flying in mist and fog that causes them to pitch in the wrong direction. Plus, I'll tell you the surprising thing I learned when I flew the Idaho Approach in a G1000 flight training device at my flight school. Last week in episode 229, we talked about why instrument pilots often don't file IFR and sometimes crash in IMC, and we talked about the percentage of instrument pilots who aren't current and yet still file IFR. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/229. And this is a listener-supported show, and we're still ad-free. So think about what you might pay for an hour of really great ground instruction, and then sign up to become a member and support the show financially at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. This week in the news, a Red Bull plane swap pilot confesses he didn't tell his teammates that the FAA denied their request for an exemption. Gunfire hits a Cessna 172 in a Massachusetts traffic pattern, and we'll tell you what a fisherman pulled up in his net off the coast of Cape May, New Jersey. All this and more, and the news starts now. From Instagram, and this is the account of Luke Akins. He wrote, "As project lead and chief pilot, it was entirely my responsibility to operate within the regulatory framework to ensure a successful outcome. I received email notice April 22nd, 2022, from the FAA that a specific exemption was not granted, and I made the personal decision to move forward with plane swap. I regret not sharing the information with my team and those who supported me. I am now turning my attention to cooperatively working transparently with the regulatory authorities as we review the planning and execution." Now, Luke said he regretted not sharing this information with his team, and I'm sure that's true. I'm guessing the team let him know that they should have been part of any decision to purposely violate the FARs, and by not telling them, he's kind of dragged them into this mess. As I said last week in episode 229, the FAA has several remedies available for dealing with these pilots. They could fine the pilots, suspend their pilot certificates for a month or two, or revoke their certificates entirely. And I'm sure we'll hear a decision from the FAA soon. From Yahoo.com, student pilot comes under fire while landing a plane at Gardner Airport. Authorities are investigating after a bullet hole was found in a plane at Gardner Municipal Airport in Massachusetts last week. The FAA said the pilot of a single-engine Cessna 172 reported a bullet hole in the gas tank after landing. The pilot tells Boston 25 he was 2 minutes away from landing at about 700 feet in the air when the bullet went through, hitting the fuel tank. Student pilot Dan Black says he and his instructor were practicing landings when they heard a pop and then smelled fuel. Once we started to smell the fuel, we knew something was going on, said Black. But we didn't think it was a bullet. We saw that fuel was coming out of our wings, so we knew we had an issue with the left tank. And we parked the plane and dumped all the fuel out into buckets. And then during that process, we noticed there was a hole in the wing. The two left Worcester Airport around noon on Monday and landed uninjured at Gardner Aviation Services. It went all the way through the wing and dropped here in the bottom side of the fuel tanks, at Gardner Aviation Services owner Dominic Scalera. Templeton Police, the Worcester District Attorney, and the FAA are investigating where the shot came from, but the owner here says it's hard to tell. "It's insane to be shooting a gun at random things and not a target or an animal is pure stupidity," said Scalera. "It could have exploded if something went wrong on landing. A couple of inches lower, they could hit the pilot. I don't know who would want to shoot an airplane, so I would like to hope it was unintentional and just an accident, but I have no idea," said Black. Scalera said as soon as they patch the hole in the plane and fix the fuel tank, the plane will be right back in the air. From avweb.com, Diamond predicting 20-minute charge for electric EDA40. Diamond says the electrified version of its DA40 single will have up to a 90-minute endurance and a charge time of 20 minutes. The company announced last week it has chosen Safran's Engine US electric motor to power the EDA40. Frank Zhang, CEO of Diamond Aircraft Industries Austria, said, quote, "With Safran, we are having an expert partner for electric propulsion systems aboard. Smart Motor's state-of-the-art technology includes smart features paired with a well-advanced certification process is the logical choice for our EDA40. We're looking forward to the first flight scheduled for end of 2022. Diamond announced the program last October. The aircraft is aimed at the training market, and Diamond is predicting a 40% decrease in operating cost for flight schools. The 90-minute endurance likely won't be achieved immediately, but will be possible as battery technology evolves. Diamond is predicting certification for the motor by mid-2023 and basic EASA certification of the aircraft in late 2023 or early 2024. From GeneralAviationNews.com, FAA begins investing $1 billion into ATC. The FAA has started spending the first $1 billion of its allocated $5 billion on the nation's air traffic control system. The funding, made possible through the bipartisan infrastructure law, will sustain, repair, or replace hundreds of buildings and pieces of equipment that make flying in the U.S. the safest in the world, FAA officials said. FAA Deputy Administrator Bradley Mims said, "There's a great deal of work needed to reduce the backlog of sustainable work, upgrades, and replacement of buildings and equipment needed to operate our nation's airspace safely." So what's planned for the $1 billion? The list includes replace towers, improve towers and approach and departure facilities, reinforce navigation, weather, and tracking equipment, long-range radars, en route flight centers, and upgrading security systems at all FAA staff facilities. From AINonline.com, Gulfstream G700 caught in crosshairs of 737 MAX fallout. Gulfstream Aerospace parent company General Dynamics warned that G700 certification, planned for the fourth quarter, could be delayed by 3 to 6 months due to a new additional requirement by the FAA. According to General Dynamics, the FAA has asked Gulfstream to perform a line-by-line validation of the software for the fly-by-wire ultra-long-range business jet. The disclosure validates industry fears about higher FAA scrutiny of future aircraft certifications in the wake of the Boeing MAX debacle. General Dynamics CEO didn't specifically mention Boeing, instead skirting around the issue by saying the time-consuming extra requirement is, quote, the result of events independent of us. He added that a delay in G700 certification will also have a knock-on effect on the derivative G800. First flight of the G800 is planned for first quarter 2023, time to occur just after G700 approval, while certification has always been 6 to 9 months after the G700. Delayed certification will also interrupt the start of G700 deliveries, though Gulfstream would increase production of other models to make up for the temporary shortfall. From AirlineReporter.com, United snuck a flight simulator onto its app, and it's surprisingly good. Last week, without any fanfare, United updated its app. No big deal, right? Well, this new update includes a flight simulator. We played it, and while it's no Microsoft Flight Simulator, for an app within an app, it's pretty great. Once you get your app updated, you hit the More button on the bottom, go to the Game Center at the bottom of the For Your Flight section, and voila, there it is. The game puts you in a Boeing 787 Dreamliner in the skies above San Francisco, the only plane and setting the game offers for now. But the terrain graphics are solid, and the aircraft model itself looks great. The game starts with a set of tutorials which get you used to the controls. You pitch and roll by tilting and angling your phone. As the tutorials progress, you take controls of the throttle, flaps, and landing gear as well. All of the simulations are landings, but the variety of approaches, times of day, and weather conditions, including wind and fog, provide some variety. The default view is from the inside cockpit through a HUD, though you can also station yourself outside the plane. As a simulator, it's basic, which also makes it beginner-friendly. One practical benefit, since it's on the United app, we assume you can play it in flight even if you don't pay for Wi-Fi. As for why United decided to put it into this app, we have no idea. Maybe there's an eventual tie-in with the United Aviate Academy, the airline's brand new flight school. Or maybe this was just a pet project from some AvGeeky employees. Either way, we're not complaining. And I updated my United app, and sure enough, it's a great little simulator, so you might want to check it out. From news.co.au, Air France pilots almost crashed Boeing 777 in Paris amid struggle. The pilots of an Air France flight from New York to Paris, who struggled to control the plane before landing, were engaged in a kind of tug-of-war, apparently unaware of each other's inputs on the controls, according to a report. The Boeing 777, with 177 people aboard, was cleared to land at Charles de Gaulle Airport on April 5th when an ATC controller heard the pilots struggling as an alarm blared in the background, New York Post reports. Dramatic audio captured one of the pilots exclaiming, "Stop, stop," and the pilot told the tower the jetliner was, quote, all over the place. In a preliminary report, France's Air Accident Investigation Agency said last week that the pilots simultaneously made inputs on the controls during the incident. Quote, the captain held the control column in a slightly nose-down position, while the co-pilot made several more pronounced nose-up inputs, the report said. Under normal procedure, one pilot would say, I have control, while the other would acknowledge the statement by saying, you have control. The investigating agency classified the event as a serious incident, an industry term meaning it could have resulted in an accident. As with other aircraft, the Boeing 777's control columns move in tandem with each other, though only one pilot is usually expected to be actively using them to fly at any given time. If opposing forces on the two columns pass a certain limit, the link between them is deactivated or desynchronized to prevent accidents in case one of them is jammed. After the landing scare, the pilots assessed the situation but did not notice that they had made contradictory inputs, nor that the columns had become decoupled, the BEA said. The jet landed safely on a second attempt and resumed service just over 2 weeks later. Quote, Air France has taken note of the communications from France probers concerning the ongoing investigations into the incident of Air France Flight 11, the airline told the site Simple Flying. Quote, pilots are trained and regularly practice these procedures, which are applied by all airlines. And from paddleyourown.canoe.com, cigarette smoking pilot caused EgyptAir plane to crash into sea, according to a secret report. An EgyptAir plane crashed into the Mediterranean Sea, killing all 66 people aboard in 2016 because a pilot was smoking a cigarette in the cockpit, alleges a secret report that has been viewed by an Italian newspaper and that is currently being reviewed by French prosecutors. EgyptAir flight MS-804 from Paris Charles de Gaulle to Cairo crashed into the sea on May 19, 2016 in what Egyptian officials initially claimed was a terrorist attack. Accident investigators, however, believe the smoking pilot theory is far more likely. The Airbus A320 aircraft plunged from 37,000 feet into the Mediterranean after one of the two pilots lit a cigarette, which in turn caused a fire to rage in the cockpit because a special oxygen mask was leaking 100% oxygen into the confined flight deck, investigators believe. The 134-page report concludes this combination of events is far more likely than the terror attack theory. The dossier was handed over to the Paris Court of Appeal last month, where prosecutors are investigating possible manslaughter charges. At the time of the accident, EgyptAir did not ban pilots from smoking in the cockpit. The oxygen mask had been replaced several days before the accident, but the engineer who fitted the mask allegedly forgot to switch it from emergency mode to normal mode. According to the Italian newspaper, it's a known issue that the mask can leak oxygen when set to emergency mode. The aircraft took off from Paris at 11:21 p.m. on May 19th, but by 2:27 a.m., a Greek air traffic controller wasn't able to make contact with the plane. A few minutes later, at 2:34 a.m., the aircraft disappeared from radar. No distress call was made before the plane went down. Both black boxes, one that records technical details and the other which is an audio recorder of communications inside the cockpit, were recovered around a month after the crash and analyzed by experts at the French BEA Air Accident Agency. Audio records recovered from the black boxes suggest that the pilots checked the oxygen mask, but the pilots also complained of being tired and audible yawns were heard in the recording. In 2018, the first officer of an Air China flight who was smoking an e-cigarette caused a plane to plummet 19,600 feet after he mistakenly turned off the air conditioning system, which in turn led to depressurization. The pilot had been trying to turn off the air recycling fans to prevent smoke from the e-cigarette from leaking into the passenger cabin, but the control for the entire air conditioning system was in the same control panel, and the pilot flipped the wrong switch. Shortly after this incident, China's civil aviation regulator told airlines to ban pilots from smoking in the cockpit. International civil aviation authorities have suggested a no-smoking policy for decades. From thedailymail.co.uk, Russian drug trafficker swapped by the U.S. last week for Trevor Reed was the pilot nabbed by the DEA in 2010 for plotting to smuggle 4 tons of cocaine from Venezuela to Liberia. The Russian pilot who was swapped last week for U.S. Marine Trevor Reed had never set foot in the U.S. before he was arrested for plotting to transport 4 tons of drugs he was told would eventually make their way to America. Konstantin Yaroshenko, 53, was arrested in Monrovia, Liberia in May 2010 for allegedly planning to move thousands of kilos of cocaine, hundreds of which were destined for the U.S. Struggling to make a living, he was offered up to $5.7 million by a Nigerian drug kingpin to fly them from South America to cities in Africa, court documents state. As the deal was finalized, a U.S. DEA informant who facilitated the meetings between Yaroshenko and the kingpin repeatedly told him the drugs would later make it to the U.S., possibly on diplomatic baggage aboard a commercial flight. but the DEA shut down the undercover operation before any drugs ever left South America. Defense lawyers for Yaroshenko, who served 3 years in the Russian military, accused U.S. officials of giving themselves manufactured jurisdiction over the case by mentioning the U.S. enough times to justify their involvement. They also accused the U.S. of acting like the world's police. The Russian Foreign Ministry even accused the U.S. of kidnapping a Russian citizen from a third country. But U.S. officials argued the pilot knew what he was getting into when he accepted the money. In April 2011, Yaroshenko was convicted by a jury of a single count of conspiracy in Manhattan federal court and sentenced to 20 years in prison. U.S. prosecutors say he was an aircraft pilot and aviation transportation expert who transported 1,000-kilogram quantities of cocaine throughout South America, Africa, and Europe using 5 different planes. They noted that his shipments went from South America to Liberia and from Liberia to other parts of West Africa. On Wednesday last week, U.S. Marine Trevor Reed was released from a Russian jail in a prisoner exchange with the U.S. for Yaroshenko. And finally, from pressofAtlanticCity.com, Cape May fisherman retrieves World War II-era aircraft engine from the ocean. A local commercial fisherman was out on the water recently when he recovered a World War II-era aircraft engine from the depths of the ocean. Randy Camp was on the Susan L. with his captain Jake Wiscott, fishing for squid 2 weeks ago when he felt something heavy coming into the net. Camp said he had a good idea of what he was looking at when they first discovered it, having served for 6 years as a member of the National Guard. He used to work in marine construction and previously helped the Naval Air Station Wildwood Aviation Museum with construction, so he knew right away whom to contact. The museum confirmed what Camp had found was a Pratt & Whitney 18-cylinder R2800 engine used on quite a few different aircraft, including the Northrop P-61 Black Widow fighter and commercial airplanes like the Douglas DC-6, according to the curator of the museum. It also was used in the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which the museum has on display. Joseph Salvatore, founder of the NAS Wildwood Museum in Lower Township, is planning to put the engine on display next summer on a stand with a plaque with Camp's name. There are seashells and seaweed covering the engine, so it needs to be cleaned and aired out first. It's been underwater for 70 years, Salvatore said. Throughout the years, Salvatore has seen plenty of artifacts brought into the museum by fishermen, including anchors, military ammunition, and cannonballs from the Civil War. Before Camp's discovery, one other engine was found and donated to the museum 10 years ago by Lund's Fisheries. It's a nice thing that when they find something they call us because they know it will be taken care of, Salvatore said. Camp said he finds a lot of interesting discoveries while fishing and usually collects the things he finds from rocks to bones. He's found military shells in the ocean before, but nothing like the engine, he said. I wanted to keep it. I thought it was awesome. Everyone was really excited, Camp said. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, my thoughts on the crash of a Cessna 208 Caravan in Idaho last month, including the surprising thing I found when I flew the approach in a flight training device. Plus more of your feedback and questions, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Today I want to talk about a Cessna 208 Caravan that crashed last month in Hayburn, Idaho, during its second IFR approach to the Burley airport. This aircraft was low and flying in light snow and mist when it crashed onto the roof of a building about 0.4 nautical miles short of the runway. Sadly, the 30-year-old woman pilot, who'd been the valedictorian of her high school class, died in the crash. And after spending over a full day researching this accident, I was a little sad, as like many accidents, this one most likely could have been avoided. But the reason we talk about accidents is so other pilots can learn from them, and hopefully we can save some lives in the process. Single pilot IFR is the hardest thing GA pilots do. When we fly single pilot IFR, we have to commit to excellence under what can be challenging and changing conditions, as this accident highlights. Sometimes there's just no margin for error, and illusions we're not used to seeing and misleading things we see in the air and on the ground can trip us up, which may have happened in this accident. Probably what's most sobering is that the circumstances of this accident could mislead even the best of pilots. Now let's talk about the flight. It's clear that this aircraft was flying below the MDA, or minimum descent altitude, which is allowed once a pilot has the airport in sight. If she was looking at the airport, then a visual illusion that's common in fog and mist may have been responsible for her thinking she was too high. I've crunched a lot of numbers, and it's clear that in the last 20 seconds of the flight, the aircraft was descending at the steepest gradient that it had been at during the entire flight. Most likely that's because the pilot pitched down thinking the runway was below her. It's also possible she experienced literally a 1 in a million engine failure of the turboprop engine at that moment. For example, snow and ice could have accumulated on the PT-6 engine's air intake screen. That's highly unlikely, though if it did occur, we'll eventually learn that from the NTSB investigation. But if it had occurred, I would have expected the pilot to turn a few degrees to the left and land on the parallel divided highway rather than continue to fly straight ahead into buildings. Ultimately, I think the final NTSB report will probably say that the pilot descended too low, too soon, which is obvious from the data. But it's unlikely they'll be able to tell for sure the most important part, which is the why. Why was she so low when she crashed, just 0.4 nautical miles from the runway threshold? In addition to crunching the numbers from the two approaches into Burley, I also flew the approach in a flight training device, or FTD, that was equipped with a Garmin G1000, similar to the one in the accident aircraft. I gained a few insights in the FTD about the specifics of this approach, and I'll share that, along with other factors that may have been involved in the accident. The aircraft was a 2013 Cessna 208B Caravan owned by Spirit Air Inc. According to the pilot's father, the company has a contract with UPS to fly packages. This particular flight departed the Salt Lake City airport at 7 a.m. and crashed about an hour and a half later on its second approach to the Burley, Idaho airport. It's noteworthy that the day before, the same aircraft departed Salt Lake City at 7:47 a.m. with a flight plan for Burley. However, while en cruise, it diverted to Twin Falls, Idaho, most likely due to weather. I don't know if the same pilot was flying this aircraft the day before, but it's quite likely as cargo pilots often fly the same route day after day. The decision to divert seemed like a good one. Here's the weather for that flight on the prior day. At Burley, the automated weather reported winds 260 at 15 gusting to 23, 1 mile visibility, light snow and mist, broken layers at 1,000 and 1,900 feet, and overcast at 2,900 feet. Temperature -3, dew point -4. Altimeter was 29 or 9 or 7. And Twin Falls looked like an excellent choice for a diversion. The weather there was reported 270 at 18 knots, 10 miles visibility, overcast at 3,300, temperature -3, dew point -6, and altimeter 29 or 7.5. The minimums for the approach flown into Burley, the RNAV GPS 20 approach, are 4,560 feet or 408 feet AGL and 1 mile visibility. The approach has LNAV minimums, so it's a non-precision approach. The only other approach into Burley is a VOR alpha approach with higher minimums. There is no ILS or RNAV approach with LPV minimums into Burley. The following day, the day of the accident, the weather initially was better, but then it deteriorated as the accident aircraft approached Burley. While en cruise about 35 minutes before the accident, the weather at Burley was reported as winds at 200 at 5, visibility 6, light snow, mist, few clouds at 1,900, broken at 2,600, overcast at 3,300, temperature -3, dew point -6, altimeter 2996. That suggested that this would be a relatively easy approach since the weather was well above minimums. But the visibility dropped considerably in the next 10 minutes as the accident aircraft was making its first instrument approach. At 8:01 a.m., the visibility was 2.5 miles in light snow and mist. 4 minutes later, it was 1.5 miles in light snow and mist. And 5 minutes later, it was down to 1 mile visibility in light snow and mist. During this time, the clouds dropped from 2,600 broken to 2,100 broken. So the cloud layers were less of an issue, but the visibility was right at minimums for this approach. I was interested in seeing how well the approach was flown, so I took the lat-long coordinates from the FlightAware track, and I did great circle calculations for each waypoint to determine the distance from the runway threshold, which is the missed approach point. Also, I adjusted the altitudes in FlightAware, which are given in pressure altitude, for the local barometric pressure of 29.97 by adding 50 feet to the altitudes. When I did that, I could see the aircraft was late starting down. It leveled off at exactly 7,000 feet for about 20 seconds before beginning its descent. That descent started 8 miles from the runway, which is 3 miles inside of IREM, the intermediate fix, where the descent could have started. At that point, the aircraft had a ground speed of 131 knots. The final approach fix is at Hicklow, 5 miles from the runway threshold, with a crossing height of 6,000 feet. At 4.7 miles, just inside Hicklow, the aircraft was at 6,175 feet, so it probably crossed at least 200 feet above the final approach fix. Prior to the final approach fix, the descent rate varied between about 200 and 400 feet per minute. After the FAF, where the aircraft crossed 200 feet high, the descent rate increased to 1,000 feet per minute and stayed at 1,000 feet per minute until the aircraft initiated its missed approach procedure about 2.5 minutes later. The aircraft was still doing 128 knots and was below the minimum altitude for the approach when it was 0.5 nautical miles from the runway. If the pilot had the runway in sight, she was certainly allowed to be below minimums. At that point, the aircraft was about 275 feet above the runway threshold. On a normal 3-degree glide slope, a pilot would be about 160 feet above the threshold. However, this approach specifies a descent angle from JAMID of 3.75 degrees with a runway threshold crossing height of 40 feet. Since this aircraft was at 275 feet, it needed a 4.1 degree descent angle, so it was slightly high, but the big problem was it was also very fast. So the pilot made the right decision to fly the missed approach procedure after this first approach. Now, it's worth noting that the Snake River crosses almost perpendicular to the runway immediately before the runway threshold. In fact, runway 20 starts right at the river bank. The river is about 0.15 nautical miles wide, so it's a big river. And it almost certainly creates its own weather. I would imagine at times there is fog along the river, limiting visibility to the approach end of 20. And to make things even more challenging at this airport, there is no VASI or PAPI to runway 20. Also, there was no charted VDP or visual descent point on the chart to tell pilots at which point to start a normal descent from the MDA to arrive at the runway. So pilots have to figure out for themselves whether or not they are high or low as they make a visual approach to runway 20. So this pilot had a huge set of challenges. Not only was there light snow and mist reported, the visibility was at the 1 mile minimums and there was no visual glide slope indicator or a VDP to assist with the landing. Not surprisingly, this approach is not authorized at night, which is a good thing. The most likely reason for that would be if the obstacle survey for the airport is out of date. So besides very limited visibility, the key issue on the first approach was that the aircraft was fast, most likely because it was late beginning its descent after the intermediate approach fix. As the pilot began flying the missed approach, one has to wonder why she didn't divert to Twin Falls since the approach was now at minimums. Here's my concern. If a pilot chooses to divert on one day, what factors might make them less likely to divert again on the following day? Pilots are always inconvenienced by diversions. It means that they're now going to be late for whatever they had planned to do after they were done flying. It may mean a missed meal or other inconveniences. Plus, some pilots might start to worry about what their management will think or say after multiple diversions. I think among GA pilots, there's a certain positive character that's attributed to pilots who get the job done even in the toughest of circumstances, even if they occasionally bend the rules or bust the minimums. And that's unfortunate, as we really shouldn't lionize or reward always getting the job done if it involves busting minimums. On the other hand, pilots probably wouldn't want to be regarded as the chicken pilot who diverts too often and doesn't get the job done. But often all of this is just self-imposed pressure by the pilot that doesn't accurately reflect upon management's view of how well they're doing. I think all managers would agree they'd much prefer to be inconvenienced by many diversions than by a single fatal accident. And perhaps another factor in the decision not to divert was that the first approach was flown too fast and a little high. I've often told pilots, if you didn't fly the first approach well because you were either fast or high, you might want to consider flying the approach a second time. But if the approach was flown well and the weather is unlikely to improve, then you shouldn't fly a second approach and you should divert. So even though the visibility was right at minimums and there was every reason to divert, one of these factors may have influenced the pilot to try the approach one more time. Now let's talk about the weather during the second instrument approach. At 8:20 a.m. local time, it was still 1 mile visibility in light snow and mist with a broken layer at 2,100 feet and an overcast at 2,600 feet. 5 minutes later, the visibility improved to 1.5 miles visibility in light snow and mist. And 5 minutes after that, the visibility improved to 2 mile visibility in light snow and mist. 2 minutes later, the aircraft crashed at about 0.42 nautical miles short of the runway threshold. So the visibility, as measured at the airport, was actually double what it was on the first approach, which seemingly should have made it easier to spot the airport and land. After the intermediate fix IREM, the accident aircraft started its descent from 7,000, about a half mile sooner than the first approach, but that was still about 2.5 miles after crossing above IREM. The big difference, however, was the aircraft was much slower than the first approach, so it was able to descend at a more gradual rate. On this approach, the aircraft maintained a very consistent speed of 120 to 130 knots from the intermediate fix until a 3-mile final where it gradually slowed to 80 knots. This meant that instead of descending at 1,000 feet per minute on the first approach, the descent rate for the second approach was typically 500 to 600 feet per minute and only briefly reached 1,100 feet per minute when the aircraft was about 5 miles from the runway, approaching the final approach fix Hicklow. The rules for designing instrument approaches permit at most one step-down fix inside the FAF, and this approach does have a step-down fix at Jamid, which is about 1.6 miles from the runway. The obstacle in question appears to be a radio tower located over a mile from the airport. There are no other obstacles charted on the approach chart between Jamid and the airport. Some pilots have pointed out that there are a number of stacks on the building the plane crashed onto and have suggested that the plane hit one of those stacks. People who live in the area say that's unlikely as the stacks appear undamaged, though one ladder that goes up to a tower on the roof appears bent. The top of the stacks are at 100 feet AGL, and when I flew the approach in the FTD, as I descended along the advisory glide path, I was about 100 feet above the stacks. The stacks are not marked on the approach plate. The accident aircraft crossed Jamid at exactly 4,800 feet at 103 knots. At this point, the aircraft was arguably on a very stable approach to the airport at the correct height and the appropriate airspeed. With visibility reported at 2 miles, the airport should have been in sight at Jamid and the plane should have been able to land successfully. There are just 2 flight data points in FlightAware after Jamid. One is at about 0.9 nautical miles from the runway, and the other is at about 0.45 nautical miles, which will be less than 200 feet from the crash site at 0.42 nautical miles from the runway. At the first of these points, the aircraft had dropped 300 feet to 4,500 feet, which was 60 feet below minimums, suggesting the pilot had the airport in sight at this point, which would make sense as the aircraft was less than a mile from the airport. It had a descent rate of about 670 feet per minute, and it was descending on a 4.1 degree slope, just slightly higher than the 3.75 degree slope from the MDA to the airport. But the last data point, just 44 hundredths of a mile later, show a very different picture. The aircraft is still a little over 4/10 of a mile from the airport, but is now just 48 feet above the runway. It is dangerously low for being that far from the runway. The aircraft's speed was about the same at 80 knots. What did change was the descent rate. The aircraft was now descending at 860 feet per minute on a 6.5 degree slope, more than double the typical 3 degree descent angle at most airports, and substantially higher than the 3.7 degree slope called for on this approach. The wreckage came to rest on the flat roof of the Gem State potato processing plant, which is located almost exactly on the extended center line of runway 20. That building is about 0.42 nautical miles from the start of the pavement for runway 20. It appears the pilot pushed forward on the yoke in the last 20 seconds of the flight for reasons that may never be known. As I mentioned earlier, it's also possible she had an engine failure at that time. However, the odds of that are extremely remote, and here's why. I have about 70 hours of time in the Cessna Caravan with the G1000, and I attended flight safety for several days of training when I started flying the plane. Coincidentally, the Cessna product manager for the Caravan was also in our class. He told us the PT-6 in the Cessna Caravan is so reliable that it typically goes more than 1 million hours between events where the engine shuts down. And when that does occur, he said that's typically been due to maintenance-related issue. So yes, the engine could have failed, but there's a far simpler explanation, which is a common visual illusion that leads pilots to pitch forward on the yoke even when they shouldn't be doing it. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with some of the visual illusions pilots are taught, but frankly, there are so many of them, I can't remember them all. For example, a common one is that when landing at wider than usual runways, pilots tend to flare too high, and when landing on runways that are narrower than they are accustomed to, pilots tend to flare too low. You may recall that all of the AWOS reports prior to the accident reported mist. Here's a quote from flightsafety.org. Flying in light rain, fog, haze, mist, smoke, dust, glare, or darkness usually creates the illusion of being too high. Shallow fog, e.g. fog layer not exceeding 300 feet in thickness, results in a low obscuration but also in low horizontal visibility. When on top of a shallow fog layer, the ground or airport and runway flying overhead can be seen, but when entering the fog layer, the forward and slant visibility usually are lost. Entering a fog layer also creates the perception of a pitch up, thus inducing a tendency to push over and place the aircraft below the desired glide path and in a steeper than desired attitude. And separately, there's an article on visual illusions on safetymatters.co.in, and I think this is mostly about airline accidents. It says that 30% of approach and landing accidents occur during the conduct of visual approaches or during the visual segment of an instrument approach, and that low visibility and or precipitation are a circumstantial factor in more than 70% of approach and landing accidents, including those involving CFIT. Now, there are two other factors unique to this airport that may have played a role. One I discovered while flying the approach in a Precision Flight Controls flight training device. I've talked about the FTDs from PFC in the past. I love them because they use software from Garmin, so the screens they present are almost always identical to what you see in the airplane. The first thing I found is that the RNAV GPS 20 approach does have an advisory glide slope, so it's listed in the Garmin G1000 as an LNAV plus V approach. And although the glide slope is advisory, you can couple the autopilot to it and ride it all the way down to the MDA. And if you're hand flying below the MDA, you can reference the advisory glide slope all the way to the runway, though there are no guarantees that it would be safe to do so. When I flew the approach in the FTD, I could see that the advisory glide slope correctly led to a position on the runway, somewhat beyond the threshold, so it provided good guidance even below the MDA. So in general, periodically checking to see that you're not below the advisory glide slope is a very good practice while flying visually. The other thing I noted in the FTD was that, at least in the version of software I was using, the Snake River, as depicted on the moving map of the MFD, is significantly out of place. And that could have been a major factor if the pilot was referring to the moving map as she looked outside for the runway. The crash site is about a quarter of a mile from the river, and the river, which is about 0.15 nautical miles wide, is immediately before the runway. But when I stopped the simulator at 0.5 miles from the runway, which would be just before reaching the crash site, the MFD showed that I had fully crossed the Snake River and that it was now behind me. In other words, if I were using the river on the MFD as my primary reference, I could conclude that I was past the river and now over the threshold of the runway. And I could draw that conclusion as I was arriving at the crash site, some 0.42 nautical miles from the runway. But let me be clear, this is a totally inappropriate use of the moving map. It is never to be used as your primary reference. You must look at the primary flight instruments to determine where you are on an instrument approach. The moving map is only for secondary purposes such as situational awareness. Yet, it would be easy for a pilot to occasionally fall into the trap of relying upon a moving map as their primary reference. Now, rivers move and maps are not always accurate, but since they're probably accurate 99.9% of the time, one might erroneously assume it's safe to use them as a primary reference, which is definitely not the case. But the big question is, what was the pilot looking at if she wasn't looking at the runway? Oddly, I think it was the building the pilot crashed into. I initially dismissed this idea when I first saw someone on catherinesreport.com suggest this. But after looking at the other facts we just discussed and the buildings on Google Maps, I think it's quite possible the pilot mistook the building for the runway. First, the roof of the building is painted light gray that's surprisingly close in color to the runway. Next, the building is rectangular in shape and is roughly 500 feet long by about 180 feet wide. It's also right on the extended center line of the runway, and worse yet, it has almost the same orientation of the runway. The runway is aligned on a 202-degree heading, while the building is oriented on a 210-degree heading, just 8 degrees different from the runway. Immediately past this building, with very little space between the buildings, is another building that's about the same width and it's about 220 feet long, and its roof is painted bright white. Beyond those buildings and leading most of the way to the river is what looks to be a gravel corridor for equipment storage that's gray in color, though much wider than the two buildings. Personally, if I were paying a little too much attention to the moving map and saw on the map that I had crossed the Snake River and I was in poor visibility, I too might be deceived by the gray and white buildings, confusing them for a runway, and descend into them. And cognitive dissonance says that once our brain erroneously decides where the runway is located, we tend to reject other clues that should tell us it's not the runway. For example, at the crash site, there's a divided highway that runs parallel and to the left of the building. That same highway parallels the runway, but it's over 1,000 feet away from the runway. But it would be easy for the brain to reject that discrepancy and attribute it to the poor visibility. Regardless of what the cause of this crash turns out to be, I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. The first is that single-pilot IFR is the hardest thing that GA pilots do. In fact, it's probably harder than flying an airliner. You either need to be very good at it, or you shouldn't be flying in weather close to minimums. Also remember that in fog, mist, and rain, pilots often perceive that they're too high, which can cause them to pitch forward for the runway. And finally, never ever trust your life to a moving map. Always use the primary flight instruments to determine your position, and only use the moving map for situational awareness and to confirm your position. And if there's a conflict between the two, you must choose the primary flight instruments and not rely on the moving map. Sometimes circumstance can conspire to overwhelm any of us when we're flying. We all need to stay sharp and alert and not get misled by visual illusions or misleading things we see in the air or on the ground. Coming up next, your emails and questions, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And thanks so much for your many emails and questions. I'll get to some of those in just a moment, but I had one additional thought about verifying that you're at the right altitude as you make your visual descent at the end of an instrument approach, especially at night or in poor visibility. Now, if you're flying a normal 3-degree approach to the airport, you'll be dropping about 320 feet for every nautical mile you fly. So, for example, if you're on a 2-mile final, you should be about 640 feet above the runway. If the missed approach point is right at the runway threshold, and you make these calculations based on your distance to the MAP, then this will be a very accurate way to calculate that you're at or above a 3-degree glide slope to the threshold. Now, if the missed approach point is not the runway threshold, then you'll have to make some adjustments to that calculation. Now, remembering 320 feet per nautical mile, or just rounding down to 300, can also be helpful when you're flying in the traffic pattern. For example, if I'm turning a base that's about 1.5 miles from the airport, I know that I should be at about 500 feet as I'm making the base to final turn, since 320 times 1.5 is 480. In the traffic pattern, you probably won't have an instrument approach loaded, so the distance you're measuring would be to the airport identifier, which is located at the center of the airport, not the runway threshold. Still, this method is fairly accurate for short runways, and I use it all the time at my home airport, where the runway is about 2,500 feet long. But for long runways, the calculation will leave you high, since it's taking you to the center of the airport. So for long runways, you'll need to adjust the calculation. By the way, my airport has a 4-degree approach, so that requires a drop of about 420 feet for every nautical mile. And I hope knowing this helps you fly better traffic patterns and safer visual descents at the end of an instrument approach. Let's go to the good news. Congratulations to David Carter. David got his instrument. Way to go, David. He says, Max, thank you for continuing to give back to aviation through this podcast. I reviewed all of my recurring credit card transactions, canceled a few things, and realized I never increased my contribution to your podcast. I took some away from another podcast that I don't get nearly as much value out of and reallocated it to yours. I passed my instrument check ride back in December, and your podcast was a big help and source of ongoing motivation. Well, thank you, David. Greatly appreciate that. And here's a question from patron supporter Ray Rado. He writes, Max, good morning. I did 2 loops to Arcata today. Now, that's way up in the northern part of California, up by Eureka, on an Angel flight from Modesto to Arcata to Palo Alto to Arcata to Modesto. Close to 1,000 miles and 8 hours on the Hobbs. Boy, that's a long day. Fun. I noticed multiple times on the G1000 NXI when you hit nearest airport on the PFD, it didn't show any of the small airports I was flying over or close by. I checked all the settings on the aux pages, but didn't see anything that would eliminate these. Any ideas? Oh yeah, Ray, I'm very, very familiar with this one. So for the nearest function, if you go into the aux group and then look for the system settings page, which it sounds like you're on, there is a criteria that you can set for the minimum length of runway for airports to be displayed under the nearest function. For example, if I set the minimum to be 2,500 feet, my home airport, which is 2,480 feet long, isn't displayed, and when I'm on the ground, it won't automatically put my airport in as the departure airport in the flight plan, which otherwise happens automatically. Also, and this might be what you're thinking about, as I recall, private restricted airports aren't listed in the G1000, so you will never see those if it's not a public airport. Hope that helps. And here's a question that came in from Elijah in Tennessee. He says, I'm a young aviator. I came across your podcast on Amazon Music about a month ago and really enjoyed it. I've got a question. As a young aviator getting ready to fly in the next few months, how can I start working on the knowledge part, and what resources will I need? Well, thanks for listening, Elisha, and also thanks for your question, which, by the way, you sent the absolute best way to contact me, which I'll explain in a moment. So the cheap, easy way to get started is to go to the FAA.gov website, and there you can download a couple of the free handbooks that they offer. Now, there are also printed versions of these books available for sale for maybe $20 a piece, but they're identical to the free PDFs that you'll find online. I'll also include a link in the show notes so you can find them really easily. Specifically, you want to start reading the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge and the Airplane Flying Handbook. Now, if you read both of these, you're going to have an excellent background for the flight training, which will make a lot more sense to you when you get started. Now, to study for the written exam, I really like the 2022 Private Test Prep book from asa2fly.com. That's the number 2, asa2fly.com. Now, that sells for $19.95, and I really like it since it includes the official FAA computer testing supplement that includes all the FAA test figures, which is identical to what they use when you take the online exam. Anyway, have fun with your training and let us know how it goes. And the way Elijah contacted me, there are probably about 10 different ways people get messages to me. And I got to tell you, if you send something through social media, man, I might see it, but I'll never find it again when I go to look for it. The absolute best way is to go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, and go ahead and send me an email through that form. Guaranteed I will get it, and I'll be able to find you when I try and get back to you. So thanks so much for that. And for Patreon supporters, the messaging system in Patreon also works great, and it's easy for me to find your message when I go back to look for it there as well. And here's an email from PayPal donor Alexander Sack. He says, I just heard your confession about your first serious encounter with ice, and it really struck me, unlike a lot of West Coast pilots who barely know what ice is. You used to fly on the East Coast, and just to counter that for a moment, I will tell you that there is a lot of ice on the West Coast. It doesn't happen as frequently on the East Coast, but man, you can really get into a lot of ice out here, even in the summertime. And when I was flying on the East Coast, I had just barely started my instrument training, so I was mostly a VFR pilot when I was flying back east. He says, what strikes me about your story is because I fly around the Big Apple Bravos, and most of the Northeast New England area, ice is my number one enemy for most of the year. I mean, it is deeply ingrained in me and all of my training as a current instrument pilot and soon to be commercial pilot. But if you forget about it, so will I one day. And that scares me. Complacency is a killer. Well, Alexander, no, I don't think you'll forget about icing as you've dealt with so much of it. Complacency is indeed the big issue. We all make small mistakes in every flight. We just need to bring our A game to every flight so that we recognize the small mistakes quickly and correct them so that they don't turn into bigger mistakes. And my big mistake after flying into the ice was not doing a 180. And I was a relatively new instrument pilot at the time, so I had very little exposure to ice prior to that. And here's an email from Troy, who's a former Patreon supporter. He says, wow, what a story about icing. Glad you and your daughter made it. Yeah, me too, Troy. He says, small note, and this is a correction. I did make a mistake on this. He says, unless you're south of the equator, wind flows counterclockwise around a low. Now, it's interesting because I had that correct in my script, but my 10:30 p.m. brain misread it. Now, I did fix it, so anyone who downloads the episode will now hear that it says in the Northern Hemisphere, wind travels counterclockwise around a low. So, Troy, thank you, and thanks to several other people who pointed out that error I had in that episode. And here's an email from a PayPal supporter who'd like to remain anonymous. He says, I'm sure and I hope you've received plenty of appreciation and support for episode 227, which was the icing story. I'd like to add my own thanks since the timing and content of your icing story come on the heels of a very bad day for me a few weeks ago that could have had disastrous consequences for me and my 15-year-old son. The summary is, as a low-time pilot, 95 hours, I was already distracted by weather concerns and with being late to a breakfast gathering. The flight to the breakfast was perfectly fine, but on the way back I had a number of problems. I had not followed the shutdown checklist properly, so I left the avionics switch on. This caused COM1 to fail until I reset it. I did not see traffic on ForeFlight. Turns out it turned itself off. I never checked the setting. Flight following kept alerting me to traffic at 12 o'clock, same direction, with the distance decreasing with each call. I knew we were catching up to our friend in a slower plane, but I couldn't see him anywhere. My non-towered home airport was busy, so I made a 360 to let the pattern clean up, and then lost the airport. While trying to find the airport, I inadvertently descended to 1,000 feet MSL. TPA is 1,300 feet, but I had started at 1,800 feet. And of course, I was not yet in the pattern. I then came in high and fast on final. My son literally said, "You can always go around." I should have listened. I ballooned, and instead of adding power or going around, I stalled it 10 feet above the runway for a hard landing. Then came the worst part. I filled the left tank with 15.5 gallons of fuel in a Piper Cherokee 180. But since we filled to the tabs, that's just 18 gallons. I had not switched tanks before departing the breakfast airport. I can only imagine how bad the outcome would have been to go around with 1.5 gallons of usable fuel left in the active tank while already in a distracted state of mind. He says the net of it is, I'm safe. Pay more attention to the E part. Now, the FAA defines the E part as emotion. Internationally, CASA refers to it as eating. I tend to refer to it as energy, so I'm not sure which E he's referring to. But he says, I always do this before a flight, but hadn't really paid attention to how distracted, concerned I was. Never, ever fail to use a checklist. Aviate, navigate, communicate. They say that for a reason. Do it. You can always go around. I generally turn base to final with a go around is mandatory unless landing is stabilized and safe mentality. So many of the points you made about luck, planning, and decision-making were a factor for me. To be honest, your episode became a data point for me as I was mulling over whether or not I should continue flying at all. Thankfully, I've decided to learn from experience and keep things going. Just so you know, my next flight after the bad one, which was also my most recent flight, was 3 laps in the pattern where I literally had my best landings ever. So, confidence restored. Well, great story. And what great presence of mind for your son to say, you can always go around. And I'm so happy that my story came at a time when it was helpful for you as you were evaluating whether to continue flying. I'm so glad that you learned from that experience and that luck was on your side this time. Now, I think the key is for us to get better and better as pilots so that we don't have to rely on luck nearly as often, though I'm always grateful when I do have good luck. And here's a question from Mike in Alabama. He says, why on the low altitude en route IFR charts, where the Victor Airway and T-Route are following the same path, does the GPS portion sometimes require you to be at a higher MEA than the VOR? Example, from the EUFOLA, that's EUF VOR, Victor 159 and Tango 239, to the Tuskegee VOR TGE. Well, Mike, I looked at the route you mentioned, and the MEAs are 2,000 feet and match for part of the route, but for the 21 miles closest to Tuskegee, the GPS-based T-Route has an MEA of 2,300 feet, while the VOR-based Victor Airway has an MEA of 2,000 feet. Now, in general, that's the opposite of what you might expect. Since T-routes can be placed anywhere, they can be run up valleys and hence have lower MEAs than nearby Victor Airways that can't run precisely up the valley because they're based on VOR locations. In this case, the T-route and the Victor Airway follow the same path, so of course you wouldn't expect the GPS MEA to be higher. I've done a little research on this, and I think the answer is that the width used to determine obstacle clearance on T-routes and Victor Airways can be different. Now, in this case, there are a number of towers located 2 to 5 miles northeast of the airway as you get close to Tuskegee, and I'm guessing one of those towers forced a higher MEA for the T-route, but not for the Victor Airway. Thanks so much for your question, Mike. And here's an email from Mega supporter Tim Crawford. He says, just writing to say thank you. Your recent podcast episode 219 and 226, the CFI mock check ride, could not have come at a better time for me. The tips provided for both the oral and flight portions were extremely helpful as I just passed my check ride on March 29th. Keep up the great work at Aviation News Talk. I look forward to your episodes every week and will continue to share your content with future students of my own. Sincerely, Tim Crawford. And Tim, again, congratulations and thanks for sharing Aviation News Talk with all your students and friends. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Ryan Mattison. He says, hi, Max. I updated my credit card information on Patreon. I just finished listening to your story about icing 30 years ago. It was terrifying. I'm sure that experience was formative. I appreciate your safety-conscious approach to aviation and look forward to your podcast. Ryan, thanks so much for sharing that. And yes, it was definitely something I always remembered and learned a lot from that flight. It was the longest flight I'd ever made, and there were just so many lessons I learned from that. And thanks so much for updating your credit card. What Ryan is referring to is that every month we lose probably 5 or 6 different supporters on Patreon because their credit cards have expired and they don't go back in to update them. So I'm always grateful when people like Ryan take the time, just a few minutes to go in and update their credit cards. And speaking of people to whom we're grateful, aviation, of course, is a very small community, so I'm guessing you know one or more of these people. These are brand new Patreon supporters that have joined us in the last week. If you recognize their name, give them a call and tell them you heard their name on the show. Our thanks to Eric Glover and Aaron C., who both joined at the $20 a month level, which means they have access to the online videos that I post 2 or 3 times a month. And just a couple of days ago, I posted a video that I shot of making night landings with a student pilot here in the San Francisco Bay Area. We did 8 different landings, a couple of them at San Jose International Airport, the others at Reed Hillview Airport. And I was also testing cameras, so I did some side-by-side comparisons of what those landings looked like with the iPhone versus various settings on the Hero 10 GoPro camera. Also thanks to new Patreon supporters David Broskow, Sean Hempel, John Homebody, David Campillo, and Jason Mark. And if you'd like to join and become a member of our show, it is so easy to do. Just head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. It literally will only take you a couple of minutes to enter your name, your email address, your credit card information, and select what level you'd like to support the show at. Now, the people who do the really heavy lifting on this show are our mega supporters. Let me tell you briefly about them. Brian Deere, he lives down in Texas and is looking to start a restaurant. He flies a Cessna 172. Kevin Hendrickson, he's a pilot I fly with here in Northern California. Roy Williams, he's a Vision Jet owner in Southern California. Tyson Weiss, he's co-founder and CEO of 4Flight, which is a popular EFB app. Dave Brochet, retired from the Navy, has a commercial certificate and flies a Cirrus in the Jacksonville area. Kent Mazia, he and his wife Misty own a 2007 Cirrus at the Alpine Airport in Wyoming and have a passion for helping others to fly by volunteering for Angel Flight. Matt Souza, he's a private pilot flying a 172 out of Chicago Executive. Victor Vogel, he's a doc in Central PA, flies a Cirrus. Tim Delaney, he's a wealth manager in Eagle, Idaho, flies a Turbo SR20 out of the Nampa Airport. Stephen Elop flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CGA3+. He's the CEO of Digital.ai, which is a company focused on enterprise agile software development tools. Mike Williams, he's the president of TCB Composites, maker of composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircraft, and he flies a 172. Seth Lake, I just heard from him and I need to get back to you, Seth. He's a new DPE giving check rides, and he specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating in his beach travel air. So if you'd like to get your multi-engine rating and you can make it down to Arkansas, check it out to vsl.aero. Rick Miller teaches in the Cincinnati area, both out of the Lunken Flight Training Center and with private owners of Pipers, Cessnas, Beechcraft, and Cicadas. He would love to teach full-time, but still has that day job. Justin Winter, he brokers real estate on Lake Kiwi, South Carolina, and flies a 2019 SR22. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Coon Cat Aviation. They've got a pair of Cessna T240s and a 2021 Piper M350. Johnny McDade, he's a singer, songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss, he's a CFI at the Republic Airport on Long Island in New York. He's also teaching as a ground instructor, so if you could use any help from a ground instructor, you can reach him on his Facebook page at Ground.9 and meet up with him on Zoom. Jim Hopp, who I saw out on the ramp the other day, he's a CFI. He teaches at Advantage Aviation at the Palo Alto Airport and gives tailwheel instruction. Joseph Sheehan flew in the Navy for 8 years and now has a few hundred hours in his Vision Jet. Josiah Freeman flies a Piper Arrow out of Deer Valley, Arizona. Dylan Caldwell, he's an AME at the Naples Municipal Airport in Florida. So if you need a basic med for second or third class physical, you might want to contact him at aviatorsclinic.com. William Birch, he donates to the show in the memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakala, he's with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR finish-up, and IFR refresher courses at iflyifr.com. Don Dillman is a professional pilot who runs an airline flight department. He's also a CFI, flies a Bonanza, and he's a CSIP instructor. Rick Mattis flies a Cessna 210 out of Fort Worth Meacham. John Tosto is an attorney from Flint, Michigan, and a member of the Greater Flint Pilots Association and co-owns a Cherokee 6. Vic Bajaj, who lives here locally in the Bay Area, I've flown with him in his Cirrus. Mark Holzbach lives in southwestern PA. He's a longtime aviation enthusiast. He wants to get his private in a few years, and he runs botinsteel.com, which makes industrial fasteners. Tim Crawford, we just read an email from him. He flies a DA-40 out of Crosswinds Aviation at the Oakland County Airport north of Detroit. He runs a company called BrainSpring that helps kids with dyslexia. James Kerr, who flies an SR-22. His company makes security screens for protecting your home, and you can find out more at bosssecurityscreens.com. Ed Kelly flies Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and his 2-year-old son Bennett is his best co-pilot. Jeff Brausch. Michael Ron, he runs a small wealth management firm in The Woodlands, Texas, which you can find at thesumplanning.com. He's thinking about buying a Cirrus. Todd Cusso lives in Arizona and flies an SR-22T. Chris Carnahan, president of Boone Valley Forest Products. He flies a VTOL Bonanza out of Spirit Airport in St. Louis. Marlon Dutra works in tech here in the Bay Area, flies an SR-20 G6. Richard Clark plans to start instrument training in the fall, and he's about 18 months into the build of a Vans RV-14A. Sean Couch. Greg Campbell is a high-tech entrepreneur from Ottawa, Canada, flying a DA-40NG and working on his instrument rating. John Sendak, he's a hospital executive in the New York metro area. He flies an SR-22 G6 out of the Republic Airport on Long Island. Troy Bainbridge, he's a CFI who teaches out of the Weed and Redding airports in Northern California. He specializes in paragliders and has an advanced P4 rating and T3 tandem instructor rating. Bob Brokaw passed his private and instrument rating this year and is about to start his commercial. Victor Krabalis passed his private and flies a 172 out of Kissimmee, Florida. Rob Thomas lives near Atlanta, flies Cessna 182 with his Texas Skyways conversion. Ed Perry lives in Austin, Texas, and he flies a 182 out of the Georgetown Airport. Eric Stovall lives in Fishers, Indiana, and flies a Cirrus. Jim Winter flies an SR-20 G3. Lambo Jayabundan, he's CTO and co-founder of an edtech startup called Knowledge Book, focused on math education from kindergarten through high school. Daniel Maddox flies a G36 out of KMKC and 18AZ. Jim Gray from iRecover Treatment Centers. Don Jones, who completed his instrument check ride. John Trowbridge, and Scott Albuquin. And my thanks to everyone who supports the show, especially those of you who send me emails and questions by going out to aviationnewstalk.com and clicking on Contact at the top of the page. Thanks, too, for telling your friends about the show, and, of course, for leaving us reviews in whatever podcast player you listen to us on. And, of course, thanks so much for supporting the show financially. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.